My parents did not love me. Instead of paying attention to me, they praised my golden brothers and called me unnecessary. Hi Reddit. I guess I just need to vent. Writing this feels weird, but maybe getting it all out will help. My name's Alicia. Growing up, I was the youngest of 3 kids in a ridiculously wealthy family. On paper, you'd think I had it all: fancy house, private schools, and parents who threw lavish parties. But the truth? My childhood was a lonely, endless competition I never signed up for. My older brothers, Greg and Nick, were the golden boys. Greg was the perfect eldest son, always with a sly grin and a polished look. He was the type who could charm a room by just walking into it. Then there was Nick, charismatic in his own way, a high achiever who could effortlessly make straight A's and win every sports trophy. My parents adored them. Everything they did was met with claps, cheers, and the type of praise that could fill a stadium. And then there was me, Alicia, the quiet, awkward kid who seemed to fade into the wallpaper. I can't even count how many times my parents forgot me. One incident stands out. I was 8, and it was a rainy Friday. Greg had some award ceremony at his school, and Nick had a soccer game. I stayed late after school for a math club meeting, something I was proud of because, for once, I was good at something. The meeting ended at 4:30, and I waited by the school gate for someone to pick me up. By 6 p.m., most of the kids were gone. The janitor even asked if I needed to use the phone. I shook my head, pretending it wasn't a big deal. I figured they were just running late. But by 7 p.m., when the rain started pouring, I realized no one was coming. My little 8-year-old heart broke that day. I walked home in the rain, drenched and shivering. When I got to the front door, Greg and Nick were laughing in the living room. My parents? They were gushing over Greg's stupid plaque from his school ceremony. "Where have you been?" Mom asked casually, not even looking up from her glass of wine. "At school," I mumbled. "Oh," she said, waving it off. "We thought you got a ride." No apology, no concern, nothing, just indifference. Birthdays were another sore spot. I remember one year, I turned 10, and my parents threw this massive party. But here's the kicker. It was for Greg. His birthday had been 2 weeks earlier, but his friends couldn't make it then, so they combined my party with his. They didn't even bother to ask me. The cake was decorated with a soccer theme, Greg's favorite sport. There wasn't a single thing about that day that felt like mine. When I tried to tell my mom how I felt, she just said, "Oh, don't be so sensitive, Alicia. You're lucky we're even throwing a party." Family dinners were like episodes of The Greg and Nick Show, where my brothers took center stage. Greg would talk about his latest school project, Nick would recount some victory from his basketball team, and my parents would hang on every word. If I tried to chime in, they'd cut me off or give me a distracted nod. One night, I mustered the courage to tell them I had won a small art contest at school. It wasn't much, just a local thing, but I was proud of it. I brought my certificate to the dinner table, hoping for some kind of acknowledgement. My mom glanced at it and said, "That's nice, dear," before turning to Greg to ask about his debate team. Making friends wasn't easy either. Most of the kids I knew came from similar wealthy families, and their parents weren't much better. They didn't really understand why I wasn't normal like my brothers. Even when I tried to fit in, it never worked. At one sleepover, the girls decided to prank call their crushes. I didn't want to, so they locked me in the bathroom for an hour. When I told my mom about it, she just shrugged and said, "You need to learn how to stand up for yourself, Alicia." But the most painful memory? My high school graduation. I was never an academic superstar like Nick or Greg, but I worked hard. I graduated with honors, and it felt like a big deal, at least to me. The ceremony was on a Saturday morning. My parents showed up late, of course. When they finally arrived, they spent the entire time talking about Nick's latest college football game. They barely even clapped when my name was called. Later, at the restaurant where we went to celebrate, my dad raised a toast, not to me, but to Greg, who had just landed an internship at a top law firm. "Here's to Greg," he said, holding up his glass. "The future of this family." I stared at my plate, fighting back tears. That night, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't spend the rest of my life being invisible. I didn't know how I'd do it, but I swore I'd find a way to matter, even if it killed me. Growing up in my family was like living on the sidelines of someone else's glamorous show. If the first few years of my life taught me anything, it was that my place was to endure, to stay quiet, and to not expect too much. By the time I started school, my birthdays weren't even mine anymore. They had morphed into extravagant gatherings for my mom's friends, complete with fancy catering, expensive wine, and laughter that had nothing to do with me. I remember my 7th birthday vividly. I had begged my mom for weeks to invite some of my classmates, especially Sarah, a sweet girl who shared her crayons with me during art class, and Danny, who always let me go first on the swing set. I thought this year might be different. Maybe, just maybe, it could be a day for me. Instead, I woke up to find the backyard being transformed into a garden soiree for my mom and her friends. Not a single kid from my school was invited. When I asked her why Sarah and Danny weren't on the guest list, she waved me off like I was asking for something absurd. Alicia, sweetie, this isn't really a party for kids. You can play with your cousins when they arrive. My cousins? They were both teenagers who barely acknowledged my existence, much less wanted to play with me. The party was filled with women in designer dresses sipping champagne and talking about vacations in Europe or their latest charity work. I spent the day sitting on the steps by myself, watching the grown-ups laugh and clink glasses. At one point, one of my mom's friends, Mrs. Calloway, approached me with a forced smile. "Aren't you just the sweetest birthday girl?" she said, pinching my cheek. Then she handed me a gift bag containing a pair of socks. Yes, socks, and walked away before I could even say thank you. The worst part was when Greg and Nick decided to make their usual spectacle. Greg, ever the showman, thought it would be hilarious to smash a cupcake in my face while everyone was watching. The room erupted in laughter, and my mom didn't even try to stop him. Nick chimed in, calling me Cupcake Face for the rest of the day. When I ran to my room in tears, my mom followed me upstairs, not to comfort me but to scold me. "Alicia, you're being dramatic. It's just a joke. You need to learn to lighten up." School wasn't much better. I wasn't popular, and I wasn't smart enough to stand out academically like Nick or Greg. I tried to blend in, to keep my head down, but even that didn't shield me from the teasing. There was this one time in 4th grade when my mom insisted on dressing me in this ridiculous pink dress for picture day. It was frilly and outdated, something no 9-year-old would willingly wear. When I walked into class, the other kids burst out laughing. Greg had apparently told his friends about the dress, and somehow the whole school seemed to know about it. For weeks, I was Princess Puffy, a nickname that stuck longer than I care to admit. One of the few bright spots in my life was my art teacher, Mrs. Winslow. She was kind, patient, and seemed to actually see me in a way no one else did. When she complimented one of my paintings, a clumsy attempt at a sunset, I nearly cried. She even entered it into a small local competition, where I won 3rd place. For a brief moment, I felt proud, like maybe I wasn't invisible after all. But when I showed the certificate to my family, Greg joked that it must have been a pity prize, and my mom barely glanced at it before changing the subject. Family gatherings were another kind of torture. My aunts and uncles weren't cruel, but they were complicit in their indifference. Whenever I tried to bring up how Greg and Nick treated me, they'd dismiss it with the same tired phrases. "Oh, boys will be boys," Aunt Linda would say, as if that excused everything. "You just need to toughen up," Uncle Joe advised, patting me on the shoulder like I was a soldier preparing for battle. The worst advice always came from Grandma Ruth. She was the matriarch of our family, a woman who believed in tradition and obedience above all else. "Be patient, Alicia," she'd tell me, her wrinkled hands gripping mine. A good daughter knows her place and doesn't make waves. By middle school, I stopped trying to confide in anyone. What was the point? No one cared. I poured myself into art, spending hours in my room sketching and painting. It was the only thing that felt like mine, the only escape from a world that constantly reminded me of my inadequacy. But even my art wasn't safe. One afternoon, I came home to find Greg and Nick in my room, laughing as they flipped through my sketchbook. They had taken one of my drawings, a portrait of Mrs. Winslow, who had become something of a mentor, and defaced it with crude doodles and insults. "Didn't know you were such a creep, Alicia," Greg teased, holding the ruined page above my head. I screamed at them to stop, to give it back, but they just laughed and tore the page in half. When I told my parents, my mom sighed like I was exhausting her. Alicia, it's just a drawing. Don't be so sensitive. High school was more of the same, but by then, I had learned to build walls around myself. I stopped expecting anything from my family. I stopped hoping for recognition or kindness. The only thing that kept me going was the thought that someday I'd escape. Someday, I'd leave this house, this town, and all the people who made me feel like I was nothing. That's what kept me going. The hope that maybe, somewhere out there, I could finally find a place where I mattered. By the time I reached high school graduation, I had come to terms with one painful truth. I was never going to be a priority for my family. No matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, Nick and Greg would always overshadow me. But that didn't mean I stopped trying. Deep down, I hoped that maybe, just maybe, my graduation day could be different. I had earned it. I was the best student in my class, the valedictorian. It was supposed to be my moment. The ceremony was held in the auditorium of my high school. My classmates were buzzing with excitement, their families filling the rows of chairs. I had spent hours on my speech, hoping it would be something memorable, something that could show everyone, including my family, that I was more than the quiet girl they ignored. But when I scanned the crowd for my parents, my heart sank. The seats I had saved for them were empty. I texted my mom, trying not to let my emotions show. "Where are you guys? It's starting soon." Her response came a few minutes later. "Sorry, sweetie, we're running late." Nick's game went into overtime. Nick's game. Of course. He had some regional football tournament that day. I had begged them not to schedule anything else, but as usual, Nick's activities took precedence. My stomach churned as I stood backstage, clutching the neatly printed copy of my speech. The principal called my name, and the applause from the crowd felt hollow. I smiled through it, though, delivering my speech to a sea of faces that didn't include the ones I wanted to see the most. After the ceremony, while my classmates posed for photos with their proud parents, I waited near the entrance of the school. My cap and gown felt heavy, not from the fabric, but from the weight of disappointment. They finally showed up, nearly an hour late. My dad's tie was askew, and my mom was wearing a jersey with Nick's team logo on it. "We made it," my mom announced, as if their tardiness was a minor inconvenience. "Barely," I muttered, but neither of them heard me. Nick and Greg were with them, both of them in high spirits. Nick, sweaty from his game, clapped me on the shoulder. "Congrats, sis. I heard you gave a speech or something." "Yeah," I said flatly. "Or something." We went out to dinner afterward, but it was more of a celebration for Nick's big win than for my graduation. My dad kept replaying highlights of the game on his phone, showing them to anyone who would watch. I sat there, picking at my food, and realized that nothing I ever did would be enough for them. That was the night I decided I had to get out. Not just out of the house, but as far away as possible. I had already been accepted into a university 1,500 kilometers away, and I'd secured a scholarship that covered most of the tuition. But scholarships alone wouldn't pay for everything. I knew I'd have to work, and work hard, if I wanted to make it happen. The day I left for university was uneventful, just like every other milestone in my life. My parents didn't even drive me to the airport. Greg lent me his old duffel bag, which still smelled faintly of his gym socks, and Nick joked that I should try not to mess up too badly out there. My mom hugged me briefly and said, "Call us when you get there." That was it. No fanfare, no emotional goodbyes. When I arrived at the university, everything felt overwhelming. The campus was massive, and I didn't know a single person. My dorm room was tiny, barely big enough for the twin bed and desk it contained. My roommate, Sarah, seemed nice enough, a bubbly theater major who spent most of her time rehearsing lines or humming show tunes. She was everything I wasn't: confident, outgoing, and quick to make friends. The first few weeks were brutal. I was juggling a full course load, trying to maintain the GPA required to keep my scholarship, while also working over 20 hours a week at the campus bookstore. The job wasn't glamorous. Stocking shelves, ringing up purchases, and dealing with impatient customers who didn't want to wait in line. But it paid the bills, and that was all that mattered. I quickly learned that time management wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. My days started at 6 a.m., with coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and a hurried breakfast. Classes took up most of the morning and afternoon, and then it was straight to work. By the time I got back to my dorm at night, I was too exhausted to do much more than collapse onto my bed. Despite the chaos, I thrived academically. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. My professors actually noticed me, complimenting my work and encouraging me to push myself. It was a stark contrast to the indifference I'd grown up with. But even as I started to find my footing, there were moments when the loneliness crept in. One night, after an especially long shift at the bookstore, I sat in the break room scrolling through social media. My family had posted pictures from another one of Nick's games. The caption read, "Family night cheering on our star athlete." My absence wasn't even mentioned. It was like I didn't exist. I tried to distract myself by focusing on my studies and my job, but the emotional toll was hard to ignore. Sarah noticed that something was off and invited me to join her and her friends for a night out. I hesitated at first, worried about the cost, but she insisted. "You need to have fun, Alicia. You're going to burn out if you keep going like this." That night was the first time I felt like a normal college student. We went to a small cafe that hosted open mic nights, and Sarah convinced me to share one of my poems. My hands were shaking as I read, but the applause afterward was genuine. For the first time in years, I felt seen. But the highs were often followed by lows. The pressure of keeping up with everything, school, work, and my own emotions, sometimes felt unbearable. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I'd made a mistake by coming here, by thinking I could build a life for myself outside the shadow of my family. The turning point came during my second semester, when I received an email from one of my professors. He had nominated me for a prestigious internship, something that could open doors I hadn't even considered. It was validation, proof that I was more than just the forgotten daughter or the quiet girl in the back of the room. For the first time, I felt like I was on the right path. I haven't told my family about the internship yet. Part of me wonders if they'd even care. But the truth is, it doesn't matter anymore. This is my life now, and for the first time, I'm starting to believe that I can make something of it, on my own terms. The day I decided to cut ties with my family is one I'll never forget. It started like any other day, but it ended with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. That clarity came from a single, crushing moment, a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear, one that made everything I'd been feeling for years snap into sharp focus. I had gone home for a long weekend during my second year at university. I don't know why I even bothered. Maybe part of me still hoped for some acknowledgement, some sign that I mattered to them. My visit coincided with one of my mom's social gatherings, a casual brunch with the neighbors, complete with mimosas and overpriced finger foods. I stayed out of sight for most of it, hiding in my childhood room, which had been repurposed into a storage space for my parents' forgotten junk. At one point, I came downstairs to grab a glass of water. That's when I overheard my mom talking to Mrs. Calloway, our longtime neighbor and one of her closest friends. They were sitting in the sunroom, their voices carrying easily into the kitchen. At first, I didn't pay much attention, but then Mrs. Calloway asked about me. "And how's Alicia doing?" she asked, her tone polite but disinterested. "Oh, Alicia," my mom replied, her voice dismissive. "She's doing fine, I suppose. But honestly, Greg and Nick keep us so busy. They're the ones we really focus on. You know, it's like we only have 2 kids sometimes." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as her words sank in. "Only 2 kids." She said it so casually, like it was an indisputable fact. My dad chimed in, laughing as he added, "Well, Alicia's always been the independent one. She doesn't need us the way the boys do." They went on to talk about Nick's latest game and Greg's upcoming promotion, but I didn't hear the rest. My ears were ringing, and my chest felt tight. I stood there, clutching the edge of the counter, trying to process what I just heard. They had erased me, reduced me to a footnote in their lives. All the years of neglect, the dismissive comments, the outright favoritism. It all came rushing back in a flood of bitterness and hurt. I didn't confront them. What was the point? I knew they wouldn't understand, or worse, they'd brush it off like they always did. Instead, I went back to my room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the walls covered in peeling paint and forgotten memories. It felt like the final nail in a coffin I'd been building for years. When I returned to university, I couldn't shake the weight of that moment. It followed me everywhere. In the classroom, at work, even in my dreams. One night, after a particularly grueling shift at the bookstore, I sat in my dorm room and stared at my phone. Their numbers were saved under Mom and Dad, but the labels felt like a cruel joke. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Then I made a decision. If they could pretend I didn't exist, I could do the same. I started by changing my emergency contacts. I listed Sarah, my roommate, as my primary contact, along with one of my professors who had become something of a mentor to me. It felt strange at first, but also liberating. Next, I deleted them from my social media accounts. No more passive-aggressive comments from my mom on my posts. No more reminders of how they celebrated every minor achievement of Greg and Nick while ignoring mine. But I didn't stop there. I started researching how to protect myself financially. My parents had always controlled certain aspects of my life. My bank account, my health insurance, even my student loans. I consulted with a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Linda who specialized in family law. She listened to my story with a mix of empathy and quiet outrage. "You're doing the right thing," she said, handing me a list of steps to take. "It's not easy to cut ties with family, but sometimes it's necessary. You deserve to have control over your own life." With Linda's help, I opened a new bank account in my name alone and transferred what little savings I had into it. I changed my mailing address to my dorm and updated my student loan information to remove any parental access. It was a tedious process, but with every completed task, I felt a little lighter. The hardest part was writing a letter to my parents. I didn't want to call them. I knew they'd either guilt-trip me or dismiss my feelings entirely. So I sat down at my desk one night and wrote everything I needed to say. It wasn't an angry letter. It was honest. I told them how their neglect and favoritism had affected me, how I had spent my entire life feeling invisible. I ended the letter by saying I needed space, that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I never got a response. Part of me had expected that. They probably read the letter, shrugged, and went back to their lives as if nothing had happened. But that silence, as painful as it was, confirmed that I had made the right choice. In the weeks that followed, I started to feel like I was reclaiming my life. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I missed them, or at least the idea of them. But I knew I couldn't keep holding on to a relationship that only brought me pain. Cutting ties didn't solve everything, but it was a start. It was the first step toward building a life where I could finally matter, even if only to myself. When I cut ties with my family, I thought that would be the end of it. I imagined they'd be relieved, free to focus on Greg and Nick without the burden of pretending to care about me. For a while, it was quiet. No texts, no calls. I started to believe I could finally move on with my life. Then the voicemail started. The first one came a week after I sent the letter. I remember staring at my phone as it buzzed, my mom's name lighting up the screen. I didn't answer. I couldn't. When it stopped ringing, I saw the notification for a voicemail. Against my better judgment, I pressed play. "Alicia, this is your mother. I don't understand what's gotten into you. That letter you sent was cruel. We've always done our best for you, and this is how you repay us? Call me back so we can sort this out." Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, like she was trying to guilt me into submission. I deleted the message without responding. Then another voicemail came the next day, this time from my dad. "Alicia, it's your father. Your mother's very upset about this nonsense you've stirred up. I suggest you call us immediately and apologize. We're your family. Families don't act like this." The messages grew angrier over the following weeks. My mom's calm veneer cracked, replaced by a tone that was both accusatory and desperate. "You think you can just walk away from us? After everything we've done for you? You're being selfish, Alicia. Call us back." Greg and Nick joined in, but they didn't bother with voicemails. They sent texts, short and cutting. "Greg, this is ridiculous, Alicia. Grow up and stop acting like a victim." "Nick, seriously? You're dramatizing everything. We're your family. Get over it." Every message felt like a knife twist, but I refused to respond. I knew exactly what they wanted: control. They wanted me to fall back in line, to play my part as the quiet, invisible sibling who didn't make waves. But I couldn't do it anymore. I wouldn't. I poured my frustration into a post on Reddit. It wasn't planned. I just needed to get it out. I wrote about everything: the years of neglect, the constant favoritism, the moment I overheard my mom say they only had 2 kids. I didn't expect anyone to care, but writing it felt cathartic. To my surprise, the post blew up. Within hours, it had thousands of upvotes and comments. By the end of the week, it had over 250,000 likes. People shared similar stories, offering support and encouragement. Some of the comments made me cry. For the first time, I felt seen, not as an afterthought or a burden, but as someone whose pain mattered. The post gained so much traction that it caught the attention of a few online publications. An article titled, "When Families Play Favorites," one woman's story popped up on my feed, and I almost dropped my phone. They didn't name me, but the details were unmistakable. My story had gone viral. That's when the real chaos began. My parents must have seen the post, or maybe one of their friends showed it to them. Either way, they weren't happy. The voicemails became more frantic, more desperate. "Alicia, what have you done?" My mom screamed in one. "Do you have any idea how this makes us look? People are asking questions, and it's all because of your lies." Another voicemail from my dad was more subdued, but no less manipulative. "We understand you're upset, but airing our private family matters online is unacceptable. You need to take that post down immediately." Greg and Nick didn't hold back. Greg sent me a furious text. "You're making us look like monsters. You better fix this before it gets worse." Nick's message was shorter, but just as venomous. "Wow. Way to embarrass the whole family, Alicia." The attention my post received also brought strangers into the mix. Some people defended my family, accusing me of overreacting or being ungrateful. Others dug through my public social media accounts, speculating about the details I hadn't included. It was overwhelming, but the support far outweighed the negativity. One comment that stuck with me came from a woman named Clara. She wrote, "You're brave for sharing this, Alicia. I cut ties with my own family years ago, and it was the hardest but best decision I ever made. Don't let them manipulate you into going back." Despite their attempts to paint themselves as victims, my family's behavior only made things worse. My mom went as far as contacting Sarah, my roommate, trying to get her to mediate. Sarah was furious. She told my mom in no uncertain terms to leave me alone and hung up on her. The final straw came when my parents posted a public statement on Facebook, addressing the situation. It was dripping with self-righteousness. "We are heartbroken by the lies our daughter has spread about us," it read. "We have always loved and supported her, and we don't understand why she's chosen to attack us in this way. Family is sacred, and we hope she finds it in her heart to reconcile." The post was shared dozens of times, mostly by their circle of wealthy, image-conscious friends. But the response wasn't what they expected. Many of the comments were critical, calling them out for their hypocrisy. "Why would your daughter write this if everything was fine?" one person asked. "Sounds like there's more to the story." Another commenter wrote, "If you really cared, you'd be addressing this privately, not posting on social media." Their attempt to save face had backfired spectacularly, and I couldn't help but feel a small sense of vindication. They had spent years ignoring me, dismissing me, and now they were being held accountable in a way they never expected. I didn't respond to their messages or their public post. I didn't need to. My story was out there, and no amount of spin could erase the truth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my voice, my narrative. For the first time, I felt like I had the power to define who I was, independent of them. Their attempts to manipulate me didn't stop, but they became less frequent over time. Eventually, the voicemails slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. I don't know if they gave up or if they just found a new distraction, but it didn't matter. I was done being their afterthought. The support from strangers on Reddit and beyond helped me through some of the hardest moments. I saved screenshots of the kindest comments, reading them whenever I felt doubt creeping in. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that my feelings were valid, and that cutting ties was the right choice for me. Starting over wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The day I decided to completely sever ties with my family was the day I finally began to feel free. For too long, my identity had been tied to their neglect, their favoritism, and their manipulative ways. I was done being Alicia the forgotten daughter. I wanted a fresh start, a new life where I could be whoever I wanted to be. And that began with leaving my old name behind. The process of changing my surname felt surreal. Sitting in the courthouse, filling out the paperwork, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of sadness and relief. My new surname, Taylor, was chosen not for any deep personal meaning, but because it felt neutral, unburdened by the weight of my family's legacy. When the judge approved the change, I felt a sense of finality, like a chapter of my life had truly closed. It wasn't just symbolic, it was a declaration to myself that I was no longer tied to them. But I didn't stop there. With the help of Linda, the same lawyer who had guided me through protecting my finances, I filed the necessary paperwork to remove my parents' names from my birth certificate. It was a drastic step, one that even Linda hesitated to recommend at first. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, her tone cautious. "It's permanent." "Yes," I said firmly. "I need to do this." The process was lengthy and complicated, but I didn't mind. Every form I signed, every official stamp I received, felt like another layer of their control being peeled away. By the end of it, I held a new birth certificate in my hands, one that didn't bear the names of the people who had erased me from their lives long ago. I stared at it for a long time, letting the reality sink in. This was my new beginning. Once the legalities were behind me, I threw myself into building a life that was entirely my own. I moved to a new city, one far from the places that held painful memories. It was a small, bustling community with a thriving arts scene and a deep sense of camaraderie among its residents. My apartment was modest, a one-bedroom in an old brick building with creaky floors and a view of the river. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly at home. Finding a job was my next challenge. I knew I didn't want to work just anywhere. I wanted to do something meaningful, something that aligned with the new life I was building. That's when I came across an opening at an organization called Haven House, a nonprofit that provided support for children who had experienced domestic violence. The role was administrative at first, managing schedules, organizing events, and handling donor communications, but the mission of the organization resonated with me deeply. My first day at Haven House was overwhelming in the best way possible. The staff was a diverse group of passionate, driven individuals who had dedicated their lives to making a difference. There was Mia, the program director, who had a no-nonsense attitude but a heart of gold, Javier, a former social worker who now oversaw outreach programs, and Claire, a soft-spoken yet fierce advocate who ran the counseling services. They welcomed me warmly, and for the first time, I felt like I was part of a team that valued me for who I was. One of the most pivotal moments during my time at Haven House came a few months in. We were organizing a holiday drive to collect toys and essentials for the children in our programs. As I was sorting through donations, a little boy named Ethan came up to me. He was 7 years old, with big brown eyes that seemed far too serious for someone his age. "Are these for us?" he asked, pointing to the stack of brightly wrapped presents. "Yes," I said, kneeling down to his level. "Do you see one you like?" He hesitated, then reached for a stuffed bear with a crooked smile stitched onto its face. "This one." Seeing Ethan clutch that bear like it was the most precious thing in the world broke something open inside me. I thought about all the times I had felt invisible as a child, all the moments when I had longed for someone to notice me, to care. I realized then that I wanted to do more, not just for Ethan, but for all the kids like him who deserved to feel seen and valued. That's when the idea for my own charity started to take shape. I spent months planning, pouring every spare moment into researching, networking, and writing grant proposals. I wanted to create an organization that not only provided resources for children, but also gave them a platform to express themselves through art, storytelling, and community engagement. I called the charity Bright Futures. It started small, with just a handful of volunteers and a tiny budget, but the impact was immediate. We hosted art workshops, storytelling nights, and mentorship programs. The first event we organized was a mural project, where the children helped paint a vibrant, colorful scene on the side of a local community center. Watching them work together, laughing and sharing stories, filled me with a sense of purpose I had never known before. One of the most touching moments came from a girl named Lila. She was 12, shy and withdrawn when she first joined the program. But over time, she began to open up, using painting as a way to express the emotions she couldn't put into words. At the unveiling of the mural, she came up to me and said, "Thank you for this. I feel like I'm part of something now." Hearing those words solidified my resolve. Bright Futures wasn't just a charity. It was a second chance, not just for the kids we helped, but for me as well. It gave me a way to channel my pain into something meaningful, something that could break the cycle of neglect and invisibility for others. As Bright Futures grew, so did my sense of self. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I had built a life that was mine, filled with people who valued and supported me. And for the first time, I felt free from the shadow of my past. Building a chosen family was never part of the plan. After everything that happened with my biological family, I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone enough to let them into my life. But life has a funny way of proving you wrong. It started small, a couple of acquaintances who became friends, and then those friends turned into something more. They became my people, my real family. And for the first time, I knew what it felt like to belong. It began with Sarah, my old roommate from university. We had stayed in touch after graduation, exchanging sporadic texts and meeting up for coffee whenever our schedules aligned. But when I moved to a new city to start my charity, she was the first to visit. She showed up at my tiny apartment with a bottle of wine and a carton of ice cream, announcing, "I'm crashing here for the weekend, and we're going to binge-watch terrible rom-coms." That weekend turned into a tradition. Every few months, Sarah would visit, bringing her unfiltered humor and infectious energy. She became my anchor, the first piece of the family I was slowly piecing together. Then there was Marcus, a coworker at Haven House who quickly became one of my closest friends. Marcus was a towering man with a booming laugh and a heart as big as his personality. He had a knack for spotting when I was overwhelmed, always appearing at the right moment with a cup of coffee or a ridiculous joke to lighten the mood. We bonded over our shared passion for helping others, but it went deeper than that. Marcus had his own scars. He had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until he aged out of the system. He understood what it felt like to be unwanted, to have to fight for your place in the world. One night, over beers at a local pub, he said, "You know, family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up for you, who stands by you when it counts." That sentiment stuck with me. Through Marcus, I met his partner, Elise, a fiery redhead who worked as a nurse and had a soft spot for strays, both the human and animal kind. Elise was the one who convinced me to adopt my first dog, a scrappy Boston Terrier I named Rocky. I found him at a local shelter, shivering in the corner of his kennel. His soulful brown eyes reminded me too much of myself, and I knew I couldn't leave without him. Rocky was a handful at first, energetic to the point of chaos and prone to chewing anything he could get his teeth on. But he brought a new kind of joy into my life, the kind that comes from unconditional love. A year later, I adopted Luna, a gentle Labrador with a wagging tail and a penchant for snuggling. Together, Rocky and Luna became my constant companions, their playful antics filling the quiet spaces of my home. As my circle grew, so did the traditions we created. Monthly dinners became a staple, a way to bring everyone together. They started small, just me, Sarah, and Marcus, sitting around my tiny kitchen table eating takeout and laughing about our week. But word spread, and soon Elise was joining us, followed by Javier and Claire from Haven House, and a few others who had become part of my orbit. We took turns hosting, each dinner a reflection of the host's personality. Sarah's nights were chaotic but fun, with mismatched dishes and loud debates about which rom-com was the worst. Marcus and Elise's dinners were warm and welcoming, complete with homemade meals and an endless supply of wine. My nights were quieter, usually featuring a new recipe I was experimenting with and plenty of cuddles from Rocky and Luna. One memorable dinner was hosted by Javier, who decided to turn it into a themed karaoke night. He set up a makeshift stage in his living room, complete with a microphone and a playlist of guilty pleasure songs. I'll never forget Marcus belting out "Livin' on a Prayer" while Elise tried, and failed, to keep a straight face. By the end of the night, we were all singing along, the room filled with laughter and off-key harmonies. These dinners became the highlight of my month, a reminder of how far I had come. They weren't just social gatherings. They were a celebration of the family we had chosen, the bonds we had built despite the broken ones we had left behind. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when my past tried to creep back in, whispers of doubt that made me question whether I truly deserved this happiness. One night, after a particularly tough day at work, I confided in Sarah. We were sitting on my couch, Luna's head resting on my lap, while Rocky snoozed at my feet. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," I admitted. "Like this isn't real, like it's all going to fall apart." Sarah leaned over and squeezed my hand. "Alicia, you've built this. You fought for this. No one can take it away from you." Her words stayed with me, a quiet reassurance that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Over time, I learned to trust in the family I had created, to embrace the love and support they gave me without questioning it. One of the most defining moments came during a holiday dinner. We had gathered at Marcus and Elisa's place, their home decorated with twinkling lights and the scent of cinnamon wafting through the air. As we sat around the table, sharing stories and toasting to the year ahead, Marcus stood up and raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice steady and warm. "The one we're born with and the one we choose. I think we can all agree that the latter is a hell of a lot better." We laughed and clinked glasses, the room filled with a sense of belonging that I had never known before. In that moment, I realized that I didn't need my biological family to feel complete. I had my people, my dogs, my new life. And for the first time, I felt whole. A few days after the post blew up, I started getting messages from journalists. They wanted to know more about my story, how I had found the strength to walk away from my toxic family, and what advice I had for others in similar situations. At first, I hesitated. Sharing my story on Reddit had felt safe, like I was speaking to a supportive, anonymous audience. But going public on a larger scale? That was terrifying. I talked it over with Sarah, who had always been my sounding board. "You've already put yourself out there," she pointed out. "Maybe this is your chance to help more people." After some deliberation, I agreed to an interview with a small online magazine. The journalist, a kind woman named Paige, was empathetic and genuine. She asked thoughtful questions and handled my story with care, focusing on the emotional journey rather than sensationalizing it. When the article was published, the response was overwhelming. My inbox was flooded with messages, some from people sharing their own stories, others thanking me for giving them the courage to leave toxic relationships. The article caught the attention of larger outlets, and soon, my story was being shared far and wide. It was surreal to see headlines like "Breaking Free," how one woman escaped a toxic family and rebuilt her life, paired with photos of me and my dogs, Rocky and Luna. The exposure brought both support and criticism. While most people applauded my decision, there were always a few trolls who accused me of exaggerating or seeking attention. I ignored them. I knew my truth, and that was all that mattered. One day, I received an email from a small publishing house. They wanted me to write a book about my journey, not just the pain and the struggles, but also the healing and the life I had built since leaving my family. The idea of writing a book was daunting, but it also felt like the natural next step. I had always loved writing, and this was an opportunity to tell my story on my terms. Writing the book was both cathartic and exhausting. Reliving the darkest moments of my life wasn't easy, but it also helped me process everything in a way I hadn't before. I poured my heart into every chapter, determined to create something that would resonate with anyone who had ever felt trapped in a toxic relationship. When the book was finally published, the response was overwhelming. It became a bestseller in its category, and I started receiving invitations to speak at events and participate in panels about emotional abuse and healing. The newfound attention had an unintended side effect. It brought my family's dirty laundry into the public eye. My parents, who had always prided themselves on their social standing, found themselves at the center of a storm they couldn't control. Their friends began to distance themselves, and my mom's carefully curated image started to crumble. They eventually moved to another state, away from the scrutiny, but it was clear their social life would never be the same. Greg and Nick didn't handle the fallout well either. Without me as their common scapegoat, their relationship began to fracture. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they had started clashing over everything, from their careers to their roles within the family. It was ironic, really. They had spent years united in making my life miserable, and now they couldn't even get along with each other. Meanwhile, my life was flourishing in ways I had never imagined. My work at Haven House and my charity, Bright Futures, continued to grow, and I found myself becoming a prominent figure in the nonprofit world. I was invited to lead workshops, collaborate with other organizations, and even advise on policy changes related to child welfare and emotional abuse. With the success of my career came financial stability. I saved up and bought a house, a cozy 2-bedroom cottage with a big backyard where Rocky and Luna could run to their heart's content. Decorating the house was a labor of love. Every piece of furniture and every coat of paint a reflection of the life I had built for myself. It was nothing like the cold, impersonal mansion I had grown up in. This house was warm, welcoming, and entirely mine. Amid all these changes, I also found love. His name was Alex, a graphic designer I met at a fundraising event for Haven House. He was kind, patient, and understanding in ways I hadn't thought possible. On our first date, we spent hours talking about everything from our favorite books to our shared love of dogs. He had a golden retriever named Max, who quickly became best friends with Rocky and Luna. Alex became my partner in every sense of the word. He supported me through the highs and lows, always encouraging me to pursue my dreams while reminding me to take care of myself. For the first time, I experienced what a healthy, loving relationship looked like. It was unfamiliar at first, but I slowly learned to trust him. As my life settled into a rhythm, I decided to write one final post on Reddit, the platform that had started it all. In the post, I reflected on everything that had happened since I first shared my story, the challenges, the triumphs, and the people who had supported me along the way. I thanked the community for giving me the courage to take that first step, for showing me that I wasn't alone. The post received thousands of upvotes and comments, with people congratulating me on how far I had come. Some even shared updates on their own journeys, inspired by my story to leave toxic relationships or set boundaries with their families. Reading those comments filled me with a sense of fulfillment I couldn't put into words. My pain had become a catalyst for change, not just in my life but in the lives of so many others. Now, as I sit on the porch of my little cottage, watching Rocky and Luna chase Max around the yard, I feel an overwhelming sense of peace. My past no longer defines me. I've built a life filled with love, purpose, and happiness, a life that is entirely my own. And for the first time, I can truly say that I'm free.